Hey guys, our group decided to do our group replication project on an article by Hayes and Van Camp. They did a study on increasing physical activity of children during school recess. I'm Ashley. I'm from Macomb, Michigan, and I'll be discussing the literature review.
I'm Kelsey. I'm from New Jersey, and I will be discussing the participants' materials, behavioral definition, data collection, and the design of the study.
Hey everyone, my name is Maya Gregory. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, and I will be discussing the second, third, and fourth criterion as well as the limitations.
My name is Carly Kreitzberg, and I will be discussing the criterion levels and also our conclusions.
Hi, my name is Heather Mikowski-Horsky. I'm from Maryland, and I will be talking about the inter-observer agreement and treatment integrity.
All right. All right, so the industrial and technological revolutions have profoundly altered the occupational conditions of modern societies. The National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion suggested that more than 50% of American adults do not get enough physical activity to provide benefits. Although multiple factors are linked to excessive body weight, physical inactivity stands out as one of the most pressing contributors. One second, sorry. Many studies Many studies have conducted in reference to reinforcement, goal setting, self-monitoring, and feedback. Many years ago, Cass in 1974 examined the reactive effect of self-monitoring in 3 different experiments with a total of 250 undergraduates. Experiment 1 evaluated the effect of valence or social desirability of the behavior change in self-monitoring. Experiment 3 replicated this, but also evaluated the role of response feedback. Results indicated that self-monitoring was reactive, the valence given to the target response determined the direction of behavior change, and monitoring one's own behavior or being monitored by someone else were equally reactive, and providing performance, goal, or feedback augmented the reactive effects of self-monitoring. One study investigated the beneficial effects of setting goals and health behavior change. Goal setting theory predicts that under certain conditions, setting specific difficult goals leads to higher performance when compared to no goals or vague or no quantitative goals. It was concluded that, in fact, there is a positive linear relationship between degree of goal and difficulty and level of performance. Several investigations have linked to wearing a pedometer to increase activity as well as other health improvements, including weight loss. Rohan in 2007 suggests that with the advent of pedometers, it has been economically feasible to accurately quantify the number of walking steps that individuals take on a daily basis in the real-world setting. Van Warmer, 2004, conducted an experiment to test whether pedometer-aided self-monitoring and brief e-counseling would help overweight adults increase their activity. Physical activity was operationally defined as any activity that resulted in a step recorded by the pedometer. The participants included 3 adults who were instructed to reset the pedometer each morning, wear it for the day, and record their daily step goal each night before bed. The phases of the study included baseline self-monitoring plus e-counseling, and follow-up. They were not able to see their baseline data. An average was taken after the baseline condition. During the self-monitoring condition, participants recorded their steps each night in an Excel spreadsheet. Next was the self-monitoring with basic counseling component. This involved a step review, weekly goal setting, and praise. Lastly was the follow-up phase. This was conducted 6 months after the study ended and followed the same baseline data from the beginning. Baseline phases, including reversal, clearly yielded the fewest steps for all participants, indicating a functional relationship between self-monitoring and physical activity. Only one participant clearly improved during the e-counseling phase. two participants saw the sharpest increase in the physical activity and achieved the greatest weight loss. Aside from the limitations of the study, it is concluded that pedometers may help bridge the gap between real-world practice and rigors of behavior analytic designs, especially in situations where direct observation is problematic. Wack, Crossland, and Miltenberger conducted a study to examine the effects of goal setting and performance feedback for increasing running distance among healthy adults. The participant of the study included 5 women from the age range of 18 to 28 years old. These students were all college students, as are we. Each session consisted of a run in which distance was recorded using a sport band and sensor. Participants individually set a long-term goal for each week and a long-term goal to achieve after obtaining baseline data. Weekly meetings were held in person or through video conference and lasted no longer than 20 minutes. These meetings provided the participant with a visual and descriptive performance feedback. Granted, if the participants did not meet their goal, they were able to modify their goal once a week in hopes to be able to meet them. Researchers used a multiple baseline design along with embedded changing criterion design to track and assess performance. Participants have results at or above criterion level for 2 weeks before being able to move on to the next criterion. After all five participants increased their running distance with goal setting and feedback. In addition, they were all given social validity questionnaires. The questionnaire showed that all participants thought the goal setting procedure was motivating, that they plan to continue running even after they conclude the study. Hayes and Bandcamp 2015 conducted a study to evaluate the effects of an intervention package aimed at increasing physical activity in school-age children during recess. Subjects were recruited from a 3rd grade classroom. A total of 22 sessions were conducted. They occurred 1 to 4 days out of the week during recess. Fitbit accelerometers were put on each participant before the designated recess time. Wherever it was placed one day, it had to be placed the rest. An experimenter recorded the step data on the Fitbit display at the end of each session. They were to participate in unstructured recess activities. During baseline, the participants' band was covered, being unable to see their personal results. During the baseline phase, Fitbits were unmasked and they were encouraged to check the amount of steps taken throughout their session. They were prompted to report meeting or not meeting their goal. The initial goal was 10% increase from the amount of steps recorded during baseline. The final intervention phase including a changing criterion design from 20 to 30 to 40%. During reinforcement, subjects were given a tangible award immediately after hitting their goal. If not, they were given praise for encouragement to keep trying. All participants reached goal and showed an increase in steps taken throughout each session. When the intervention was reintroduced, all participants were able to maintain the steps in order to reach criterion. It was included that the use of reinforcement, goal setting, self-monitoring, and feedback, children increased their individual level of physical activities. All interventions are manageable and time conscious.
So I will be first discussing the participants and materials. So this study that we replicated consisted of 5 participants, all who are enrolled at Ball State University and students in SPCE 611. The participants were all female, with 80% majoring in applied behavioral analysis and 20% majoring in special education. Participants were chosen at random by signing up for a group at the beginning of the semester. For this study, the intentions were to track how many steps were taken in a 20-minute session throughout the day, with the overall goal of increasing steps. In order to track the steps, the participants used an iPhone, which was equipped with the Health app, which has a built-in pedometer which automatically counts the steps. Also, in order to keep track of the predetermined time of the 20 minutes, participants would use the Clock app, which is also located on the iPhone, and use that. The Clock app would then be started at the start of the time, and a timer would go off saying that the allotted time has come to an end. Also, at the end of that, the participants would take a screenshot of the step total in order to have a record of how many steps were taken during that session. And also, they could take those steps and compare them over the baseline as well as the intervention phases that were to come. The screenshot was functionally assessed by pressing the lock button and home button at the same time, and that would take the picture. Lastly, a second iPhone was needed once a week per participant when recording the IOA data. Next, I'll be talking about the behavior definition. The behavior we were looking at was, like I said before, to increase the amount of steps taken by walking. Walking is defined as traveling on foot at each individual standard pace, proceeding forward by steps. One must move by advancing the feet alternatively in a continuous forward motion. Non-examples are walking with an elongated gait or at a pace that is faster than standard. Next, I will talk about the data collection. For data collection, we took it in 2 phases, baseline and intervention. For baseline, it was the initial stage of the study, and that was being collected Monday through Friday that first week. Baseline occurred through self-monitoring to ensure participants were setting the iPhones at 0 to begin, and any other record of steps during that day were deleted. Once that the phone read 0, we then started the 20-minute timer, and that could be at any point during the day. The iPhone was placed in the participant's right pocket, so the number of steps being recorded was unknown. So when the timer sounded, it indicated that the 20 minutes was over. And like I said, the participant would then screenshot the steps on the phone and keep it for record. In order for baseline to be considered complete, it was recorded until stability was reflected in the data or there was a lack of upward trend. Baseline was recorded on a line graph, which was then created in Excel. For the intervention phase of the study, the data collection was followed through all phases as it was for baseline. However, during the 20-minute sessions, participants would periodically look at the steps taken. And in order to do that, they would set a 5-minute timer. So every 5 minutes, they would take a look to see if they were on track for meeting their goal. Prior to the session beginning, the participants would calculate their own personal goals. And that would be by taking the baseline and adding 10% until there was a stable increase shown across 2 sessions. And that was the same for 20%, 30%, and a 40% increase. For not meeting the goal, the participants would just give themselves a verbal praise of like, try again next, or verbal encouragement of try again next time, something of that sort. And for each percentage that was met, the participant was reinforced with time in a preferred activity. For meeting 20%, they were given 10 minutes. For 20%, it was 30 minutes of time. For 30%, it was 45 minutes. And for 40%, it was an hour. Next, I will talk about the design of the study. So the original design of the study used a reversal design, which is essentially taking a baseline, doing an intervention, going back to a baseline, putting another intervention in. Because of the time constraints that we had, that was not conducive for our study. So we decided to go with a change of criterion design, which essentially is taking the baseline and then for changing the intervention phases as each phase was met. So once the 2 days of stability was achieved, we then went on to the next change or the next criterion. And Carly will talk about baseline and treatment.
So baseline data were collected during the participant's recess time, and that just being any free time, any 20-minute period throughout the day where the participant could record their steps. The averages range from 268 steps to 958 steps during this 20-minute interval, depending on the participant's activity level and what their day typically consists of. Not everybody had a built-in time throughout the day where they dedicated time to walking to increase their physical activity. And the baseline average across all 5 of us was 634 steps. So below you can see all of our step data. Kelsey had 295 steps. Ashley had 1,053. Maya's baseline was 325. My baseline average was 676, and Heather's was 995. So as we proceeded, as Kelsey stated before, we went ahead and added those criterion levels to determine what level we needed to reach for the final goal. And Maya will take over for the criterion data continued.
So as far as the criterion data was concerned, each participant had different times of the day segue to take the data. Each person here have different jobs, different job requirements, whether they're more sedentary, such as desk jobs, or more active, such as working with children. So in knowing this, each person had different data that they utilized in order to make sure that they were able to get the 20-minute steps in. We did not use the same 20-minute time period for each student, simply because, for each participant, simply because we understand that each person has different things going on during the day. And so that also determined each person's individual data. For the second criterion, which was the 20% increase, on average, each person took about 2 sessions before they were able to reach a 20% increase, which the correct number was about 1.8. For the 30% increase, each participant averaged around 2 sessions before reaching a 30% increase. The real-time number was, again, 2.25. And then before reaching the 40% increase, the average was about 1 session. Using this data that was shown here, the data shows that on average, each participant was able to gradually increase their steps overall, as well as that the participants were able to increase their steps despite of outside factors. It was also shown that with the criterion data, each participant looked upon what they were doing throughout their day in order to assist them in hitting their target goal of the 20% increase, the 30% increase, and the 40% increase. So each participant had to decide what they needed to do from baseline all the way through each criterion to determine what would be necessary in order to increase their steps. You'll just see how each person's were able to increase their data as the criterions went on.
So I will be discussing every person's individual results. And in my last session, I misspoke. I actually read the first criterion level goal, but at this point forward, I will discuss the baseline averages and how they compared to their terminal goals. So Kelsey's baseline average was 268 steps. Her highest average was found actually in her third criterion, which was 643 steps. The highest step session was 920 steps. In her final session, she took 728 steps, which was a 171% increase from her baseline average. So good job, Kelsey. Next slide. And Ashley's results are as follows. Her baseline average was 958. Her highest average was found in the fourth criterion at 1,380 steps. Her highest step session resulted in 1,387 steps, and that was also during her final session, and that was a 44.7% increase from her baseline average. Next slide. This is Maya's results. Her baseline average was 295 steps. Her highest average was 875 steps, and that was found in the first criterion. And because she had modestly, low criterions throughout, she was able to achieve that goal throughout the rest of the criterion levels and achieved her highest step in the final session at 994 steps, which was a 237% increase from her baseline, the highest increase from any of our data sessions. My data is as follows. My baseline average was 744 steps. My highest average was found in my fourth criterion, 1,000 criterion at 1,364 steps, and my final session was 1,212. That was a 63% increase from my baseline average. Next slide is Heather's results. Now, unfortunately, Heather was not able to complete the project because she had an illness, but even in her first session, she was able to raise her criterion levels and move on to criterion 2. So Heather's baseline average was 905 steps. Her highest average was in the second criterion, which was 1,275 steps. In her highest step session, she took 1,697 steps. And in her final criterion session, she took 853 steps, which unfortunately was a 6% decrease from her baseline average. But it's hard to consider that data because she was facing some difficulties due to illness. But overall, she was able to move through the first criterion level successfully before she had to stop due to her illness.
In the original study, the inter-observer agreement had a second observer 2 to 3 days a week for each of the participants. The restrictions of our project were that we couldn't include any outside personnel, being friends or family. Due to that restriction, we decided to use a second device as that second observation of our step count. The second device, as noted earlier, was another Apple device that also had the same health app that we were using every other day of the week. When you look at our averages, we have the averages for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Each participant took one day of the week that they would use two devices to calculate their steps, and they would take the details from both devices to calculate their agreement for that day of the week. In the end of the study, we averaged out every participant's inter-observer agreement information and came out with a total IOA of 91.44%. This is a deviation of about 8.5%. Because of the high frequency of the behavior we were looking at, being the steps, that is an acceptable deviation. So I would say that this inter-observer agreement for our project was successful. However, it is noted that the numbers where the inter-observer agreement were the lowest were based on devices that were different versions, such as an iPhone 6 being utilized with an iPhone 8. If the study is going to be replicated by anybody, you would want to make sure that the two devices you're using are the same device and the same version of that device, so that your step counts are in line with each other. Right, in the next slide, we'll talk about treatment integrity. For treatment integrity, our group came up with 5 criteria that we decided were required in order to successfully replicate the behavior and the study each day of the week by each participant. Those behaviors were walking on foot, proceeding forward, having the required materials, using a timer, and being independent of others. If there were any modifications made for a person's abilities and such, those modifications would be subtracted from the total of each of the criterion that were required. Each day of the week, you'd have a total, and then we would have our percentage for the week of meeting those criteria. Our total treatment integrity for all participants across the entire study was 95.44%. It seems like an acceptable level. However, walking with another person could greatly influence a decrease or increase in step count. If you notice in our scores, what we noted in our study was that the first 3 criteria resulted in 100% across all days and all participants, meaning that all participants on all days were walking on foot, proceeding forward, and having required materials. Some areas where they lacked a little bit were being independent of others, which, as we said, could influence the step count, and using a timer. It would be suggested for future replications that the timer be a separate device from the device you're using to count your steps. I know for myself and possibly others in the group, if you were resetting your step count before you started doing your steps, you could forget to set the timer as well, being that it's on the same device. So it is recommended that you use an additional device to actually set the time that you are walking.
So as stated before, each participant experienced different limitations throughout the execution of this study. And so with each of the limitations, we believe that it has affected some of the data that was achieved. Also, as stated before, each person has different jobs that they have that could have also affected some of the data presented. But these were some of the key limitations that each of us found to be influential in us not achieving as high as steps as we may have wanted to throughout the research study, or could have just been the reasons for what data we were able to accumulate. For myself, I have a more sedentary position. So when I was out of my seat, it was not just at one particular moment, it was for different things. So I used 20 minutes for whenever I knew I was going to be out of my seat for longer than a few minutes. And in doing so, sometimes my steps were high, while other times my steps were low, because of the amount of walking time that was required in doing certain activities at my job. Kelsey mentioned that she experienced the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect is simply knowing that she was being recorded, knowing that something is happening, which can alter the data that is being acquired, and can also alter the behavior. So, in knowing that she was going to be recording herself, she may have done more steps in one session than she may have done in another session, which when Hawthorne effect did not come into play as much. She also stated that she was less active during her baseline due to different job requirements. And so in certain times that she may have been active in certain points of her job, baseline may not have been the most active for her. However, she found that she just increased her activity throughout the time that she was working in order to achieve more steps. She also stated that iPhone calculations through the IOA data also could have been a limitation for her as well. And I believe Heather stated as well that certain iPhones, if you're using an iPhone 6 and then your IOA would be utilizing an iPhone 8, you could see an alteration of steps. Carly said that she was taking her 20 minutes during the times that she would walk her dog. And during those times, she is not just relying upon the steps that she takes, but also whatever steps her dog decides to take as well. And in doing so, that can result in an increase or decrease of steps taken while during those 20-minute sessions. During the last few data points, she did decide to take data without walking her dog, which also, as shown in her graph, helped to increase some of the steps that she was able to achieve. Ashley also mentioned that she experienced Hawthorne effect, and knowing that she was that the data was being calculated for her as well. And so that also showed in her data. Heather also listed that her daily steps are typically high, which made it difficult for her to really increase her step count regardless of her reward. And so in knowing that you already do a lot of things, it can be harder to increase already high levels of activity, which can definitely result in a limitation if you are trying to work to increase steps more than usual. And we can go to the next slide.
And finally, we can discuss the conclusions. So self-monitoring was proven to be effective self-monitoring proved to be effective because each participant increased their average step count from baseline at some point throughout the replication. The baseline average was set, and then as we move through our criterion levels, we were able to see an increase at some point. Even though Heather was unable to finish the project, she still saw a criterion level increase as she moved through the project she was able to complete. So 4 out of 5 participants saw an increase in their average number of steps after the very first phase, meaning that they were successfully able to move on to the next criterion level. And 3 out of 5 participants saw an increase from baseline in every single phase, meaning that criterion level 1, 2, 3, and 4 all resulted in an average step count that was higher than their baseline average. So the majority of us were able to complete that goal. And then all participants, except for Heather, unfortunately, we can't include her in the conclusions. All participants who successfully completed the replication were able to meet their goals for 2 consecutive sessions per criterion level, which was the set number of criterion levels that must be passed in order to move on to the next one. All 4 of us who were able to complete the project to the end moved from criterion level 1 to 4. We never plateaued. We never reached a point where we were unable to reach the final criterion level. All participants who successfully completed the replication exceeded their highest criterion level for at least half of the sessions in their final phase. The final phase was a 40% increase, which is a pretty high step goal, and all of us were able to meet that goal for at least half of the sessions in the final phase. And two participants, exceeded their highest criterion level for every session of the final phase, meaning we were not only meeting but exceeding that goal for the final session, showing that the self-monitoring and reward and package that we had set up was successful for us in the final phase. So that is our project. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. And here are our references, a quick list. And that is all. Thanks, everybody.